You're listening to Talking Threat Intelligence, a podcast dedicated to uncovering the new challenges of today's threat landscape. Each episode, we connect with some of the world's leading practitioners to share stories from the front lines of corporate security. And now, on to the show.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Talking Threat Intelligence. I'm your host, Robert Value. And my guest today is Scot Walker, principal of Walker & Associates and host of the Protective Future podcast. Now, Scot, last week, you and I had a great conversation. You said something really interesting to me. You said that one of the biggest challenges your clients are talking about right now is resignation. And I thought that was really interesting. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot. And thanks, by the way, for having me, Robert, again on the podcast. It was a lot of fun last time we did it, and I'm glad to be back. And we've been talking a lot in society about how do we return to what some are calling the new normal or this new work environment. My concerns, even before the pandemic was occurring in early 2020, was, are we going to continue to work like we've always worked? And we have some of the most significant shifts in the work world or the work class that we've ever had in kind of modern times. We have a whole generation, the baby boomer generation, that's going into retirement and leaving the workforce. And we have one of the smallest generations in American history, the Gen X, which is starting to ascend. Before, that was really hard for Gen Xers to ascend and become leaders in organizations because the baby boomers were holding fast on those positions. And now we've got kind of an accelerator. You know, this is the turbo boost in the economy to get to a new kind of this new world of, are we going to be hybrid? Are we going to be remote? What are we going to do? Where we have had people who have been forced to leave the workforce. And how is that going to affect kind of our future generations? And some are calling it the Great Resignation. I call it the Great Shuffle, really. Everybody is kind of becoming displaced or disenfranchised with their current or ongoing status quo. And so people are making a pivot. They're making a change. And we can't be surprised when this happens.
I like how you pointed out that there's a lot of different trends. And one of the ones that you mentioned there was the baby boomers retiring. And I think a little bit of it comes back to just burnout from a lot of people working overtime during COVID. And then, like you said, a lot of trends kind of coming together and forcing this big headline all at once at the moment.
The real challenge is for business owners and business leaders and managers, because we've never had this many generations in a workforce. And we're even starting to break the newest generation down into many different parts. And millennials don't want to be considered Gen Y and so on and so forth. And that really is going to add a challenge, but I think in a good way for leaders, corporate leaders or business leaders to kind of accept and accelerate their own business. It's the reality. And it just was, I think, sped up because of COVID.
Do you have any interesting examples that you've seen from your own conversations with clients?
No, I'm just kidding. We got
It's a big trend, but it's never happened to me.
Come on, let's keep it light. Yeah, even in my own personal life, my personal experience, I've seen where we've had folks who were working for a company for a very long time. Maybe they were part of the baby boomer generation, and they've made a decision that I don't want to have to fight people wearing masks. I don't want to have to worry about, does everybody have a booster shot? I want to spend what has made people that I've seen, been experienced with, realize is that life is short. They're asking themselves, do I want to spend time doing things with people that I don't appreciate as much as people I do appreciate? And so that's this kind of big hand wringing that a lot of people are doing. Specifically, my biggest concern is our baby boom generation, because they are the biggest in I think, the history of the United States. And so they have made a conscious decision to kind of en masse not be part of the economy in the way they were before. And COVID has made everybody kind of pause because they've lost so much. And whether that's lost time or they're actually losing friends and relatives and coworkers, and it's given them this pause to say, I don't know if I want to be part of this. And that adds additional friction in transition to business and the economy. And not to say that that's bad, that they've made a conscious decision to be in a different place doing different things, but that has changed the status quo. I'm a Gen Xer. What our parents told us was you come up, you work for a business or an industry for 20 years, you get the gold watch, and then you go do something else. And my generation and the generations that are coming behind us, which are even smaller than my generation, unfortunately, what we're starting to see is I don't want to be part of that. I don't want the gold watch. I want to come, do a thing, go away, learn something, go do another thing, then stop doing that thing, go learn something. And it's not secular, but it's like waves now. And so the economy wasn't really created for these waves. And that's adding friction to business. And so now as a kind of risk professional and a security professional and an investigations professional, I need to advise clients or help businesses understand when there's friction, because they might not understand that. Why is a millennial manager managing a baby boomer in a certain way, or a Gen Xer in a certain way? Or why are they managing a millennial in a certain way? And why is that causing friction? So I try to help businesses understand that, but because I think it's going to kind of be our foreseeable future over the next decade.
I love that point that you mentioned just about work-life balance, that a lot of people are reevaluating their role in the workplace. And my personal experience was when I was locked down over COVID for 4 or 5, 6 months or whatever, we were locked down here. And at my previous role, just like reevaluating, is this what I really want to do with my life? That was the catalyst. Start looking around for different opportunities. And it's how I ended up at Carrot Life Wrap and now doing a podcast quite randomly. And so I think when you lock people down for months at a time, they can't help but start thinking about it. It's like, well, I was in this role. And, is this really what I want to do? And then combined with the fact that we have such a tight labor market now where there's so many opportunities that employers have to, realize that there's lots of stuff to go out there and seek. It's a great time to be moving. It's no surprise that we're having this as the outcome.
Yeah, and I was listening to a report yesterday that business owners are becoming concerned about this kind of ghosting trend where they're hiring people that never show up for the job. And so they're offering all kinds of incentives. And while this might be new for the economy or for business, it wasn't really something new that I had seen similar type activities in law enforcement. Early on in my career in the 90s, we would be in training or an academy or something, and a certain amount of people just never showed up. And that seemed strange to me at the time. You put 6 months of your life on hold and you're trying to get into law enforcement, and it's something that maybe you're passionate about. I don't know. It wasn't even crossed my mind not to show up, but people did, or they quit halfway through something. And I'm not wired that way. And I don't know if that's a generational thing or a personal thing, but we're in a new world that people maybe wake up in the morning and go, I don't want to do it anymore. And then they'll make the pivot. They'll just change. And how do you plan for that? And how do you build a global economy?
I kind of want to transition now. We talked about this before. We had kind of 2 tracks of where we wanted to go with this podcast. One was the challenges that this presents for security managers and executives just trying to keep people on their team and what they can do about that. And then also wanted to think about, and you outlined, the security challenges of having other people in the organization leaving en masse. So why don't we just jump into one of those first 2 there? What does the Great Resignation present as a challenge for managers from like that team leader perspective?
Yeah. And this goes back to kind of my generational statements earlier, where what we had was kind of this campfire chat of knowledge from the previous generations where they'd been in the industry or they'd been in the company for many, many years. They knew everything about how to run that entity the way they had been running it. And when you have a change that's so drastic where you had people, maybe you didn't lose over the years, everybody in a business unit that had been there for longer than 5 years, you're starting to see that now. Now it's less frequent to have people who had more than a couple of years of knowledge about how that organization was run. And so the big concern is they don't know what they're doing. Now, that's subjective and very tactical thinking. But when we look across the whole economy and we have this churn of people who are leaving, human resources aren't traditionally set up for big churn like that. I saw this in Silicon Valley too, by the way, in the mid 2010s, where we would hire an engineer kind of for like 6 months on a project, and then they'd be on to Google or Facebook or the other company that wanted to bring them in, and then they'd go work for a startup, and then they'd be back into a big company. And they kind of just went from company to company, and it was
mercenary mentality.
Yeah, if that works for that industry, then fine. But I think it is impactful because not every industry is set up like tech, where it's very rapid and very fast paced. In manufacturing, you have sometimes much longer supply chains, much longer product runs. There's maybe even more billions of dollars at stake. Think about building a car as opposed to building a phone, much more complex and complicated. And so that workforce comes in, and the businesses are not established. They haven't established how to help employees deal with that. They haven't really accepted and given tools. I know there's a lot of research on this now, but they really haven't accepted and given tools to managers on how to lead people like that. Because maybe you have a manager who's never been a manager before, and they were kind of forced into this position. And again, this all creates friction, and friction is where generally folks like myself, security investigations practitioners, get brought in, because the problem will manifest itself in some type of disgruntleism, workplace violence, workplace incident, fraud or allegations of fraud, things like that. And so we get brought in to understand what's happening and plug that hole, plug that leak. If it's fraud, it's make sure we don't continue to lose money. If it's a workplace violence issue, keep everybody safe, which those are very broad statements, I realize, and not exactly easy to do. But in my practice, what I've tried to do is get to the root cause of a situation. And that's why I try to understand what's really going on. We had a good performing employee. Sure, they'd only been there a few years, good performing. And then all of a sudden they made strange decisions, or what the industry society would consider to be strange, stealing from an employer, explosive outbursts in a meeting, things like that. What I've been finding is that everybody is really stressed out because they just don't know what tomorrow looks like. And so the empathetic part of me says that we all need to take a pause and try and understand that.
One of the words there that I really liked that you used was just friction. And kind of the image that came to my mind with the Great Resignation was this is just pouring a bunch of sand into the machinery of the business and just getting in between the gears. And it's not shutting it down, but it's making it much more difficult to actually run the machinery very effectively. And what other kind of friction comes up as a result of the Great Resignation from just a security perspective?
This is a great transition too, because where I always say where there's friction, there is opportunity. So every time you introduce friction into something that is allegedly a well-oiled machine, it breaks down. The best example is a home office versus a physical standalone office. Security-wise, what I do know is that when people aren't physically in a location like they were before, that opens up the profile of that business or that location to fraud or to theft or to burglaries.
With the empty buildings, it's kind of like if you're a robber going through the neighborhood and you're thinking, okay, I want to see newspapers on the balcony. If that's still a thing anymore. Yeah, I want to see some uncut grass, all those kind of signs. And that's my target right there. Unshoveled driveway if you're more up north. Whereas it's same thing with corporate headquarters.
Yeah. And if I know that nobody's in there, but I've had clients who've been burglarized during the pandemic and they had no tint on the windows, and anybody walking by just saw an empty office with tons of computers. And of course they get hit and they lose all their laptops. And you can't be surprised, or this ability to pause should give us the ability to look at our resiliency and our business continuity plan. And part of that is, do we need to redo our risk assessments, our security risk assessments of our physical assets? And that's what I'm seeing is a lot of people are doing that reassessment. You should be doing a reassessment with some frequency all the time anyways, at least once a year, because your threats change in the environment. And California is experiencing this right now with people who are experiencing homelessness, and now they're camping on public or private property that was a company, was a business office, let's say, and now you've got homeless people living in the back. Is there something that you can do to understand that risk? And I am a big proponent of doing a threat and vulnerability risk assessment so that you can understand what's changed and what is going to continue to change. Will we continue to have people experiencing homelessness? Can I get the county to come provide programs and assistance to these people rather than just shooing them and chasing them off your property? That has been proven not to necessarily work all the time. So we've just got to reassess and readjust these things, these perceptions.
What are the kind of risks that might come up from having so many of my employees leaving my organization kind of all at once that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, sustainability and stability on the people that knew how to run your business is probably the biggest risk. But you also have a risk of loss of intellectual property. I talk with a lot of clients about when they're onboarding or offboarding people, what kind of access are you giving? And I was just literally talking with an old friend from when I was at NVIDIA, and we were reminiscing about an employee that was separated from the company. I don't recall what, if he was terminated or what the situation was. But back in, the mid 2010s, he was allowed to come back on campus and use the cafeteria because we had free food and the thing was subsidized, but he didn't have an access badge. And so we went to HR and we're like, why is there a former employee eating lunch by himself? Not like, oh, I'm going to come back and see the team. It was, I'm going to come back and just eat food. And so we had a challenge of like, can we be empathetic? Sure, he was a long time employee, super person. And so we did a workaround. We just check in with us. We'll give you a visitor pass and we'll let you go on your way, right? He didn't have access to the buildings or any place where there was IP, but there is that concern. You're offboarding people maybe with more frequency than you ever have before, and you're onboarding new people. How are you securing your intellectual property? That's going to be the real challenge, because especially if the secret sauce, the kernels, herbs, and spices are what make your company the millions or billions of dollars that I hope you're making. If they leave, what are they taking with them? How are they engaging that? How are they using that potentially in their new venture?
You mentioned that, and I just was reading a story today on, I forget which one of Elon Musk's companies. This is what's like Tesla or Solar City or SpaceX and Twitter now. Does he own that? I don't know by the time this comes out. We'll see. But one of the employees that either resign or they let go had all the some source code and might have brought that to a competitor. And we don't think about that, but your employees have access to so much when they're doing their operations day to day.
This maybe goes back to the previous mindset previous to the 2020s, but we never want to assume that our employee is doing something bad, and quite the opposite. We want to give them a high level of trust because we care about them and we want them to do well and we want them to succeed. Even when they're leaving our company, most of the time we want them to go on and do great things, and they will, and they do. There is a minority that takes advantage of that, and boy, can you imagine the pressure now? If every company, and we saw this in Silicon Valley, and now I think other industries are seeing it, but every company has had competition, and they've all had difficulties finding talent. And if you have a very specific project that you need help on, I don't know, like electric vehicles or something that you're manufacturing, and you've been manufacturing them longer than any other company in the world has been doing it, your competition is going to they're going to go on LinkedIn and they're going to find that engineer who's got the 3-letter code for whatever training specific certification they have, and they're going to hire that person away. And in that recruitment process, maybe it's mentioned that, we need some help with battery tech, and if you've already got some things that we can utilize that will help us scale our project and what we're trying to do, why don't you bring that with you? There's a lot of pressure on kind of both sides of the aisle, the folks that have the IP and the folks that need the IP. It will reduce the good judgment sometimes of people who will take advantage of that. But I think you need to put protections in place. If the way you make the sausage is different than anybody else, then you really need to be aware that there's an economy for that.
I'm enjoying the food metaphors here, Scott. You got the herbs and spices. You got how the sausage is made. You're making me hungry because around lunchtime for me. And once again, kind of going back to our two themes here for this podcast, what advice would you have for a manager that's looking to keep people on their team and minimize retention and not have their best employees poached by competitors? And what would your advice be for a security manager for dealing with some of the risks that come about with having all these people leaving their organization?
Yeah, kind of for both of those folks, I think you got to understand the generations are different now than they have ever been before. And we're kind of at odds now more than ever before, and be empathetic to that. Understand that everybody is an individual. I think there are definite ways to speak with certain generations. It does come down to personality. And I realize this is tough to scale. We talk about in public safety, span of control. Span of control is about 8 people, depending on who you're talking to, 7 or 8 people. And if you've got hundreds of people to work for you, I realize what I'm telling you is really tough. But if we can empower people to make decisions on their own at a lower level as in responsibility, let's do that. And so from a people manager standpoint, listening is always better than speaking. And we really should be trying to hear what our folks are telling us and ensuring that that is aligned with the goals of the organization. So if you're not clear how to lead people from a goals standpoint or a mission value standpoint for your organization, it's time to get clear and ask those tough questions, not from a point that you're trying to be disruptive, but from a standpoint of you really trying to help the people that are going to be doing and moving that mission forward. The mission comes first. But right now, we can't do that mission without the people coming first. It's a bit of a change from the mission was always first, and now it's like, well, we can't do the mission without the people, so let's take care of the people. And we're starting to see more tools and more programs for folks in larger employers where they have employee assistance programs. And this comes back to that, where I, as a security investigations professional, get called in, right? We have a problem with employee. We're calling somebody like me. We're going to engage some threat mitigation stuff. Well, much more sophisticated organizations realize that. And so they're engaging that. From a security manager standpoint, when you're in larger organizations, it's tough. Do you have the relationship with your human resources partners that they will engage you or they will let you know when new headcount is coming in? And do you have an opportunity to, at that time, influence them or inculcate them into the tribe? And what I mean by that is, do you have an opportunity to express upon them the level of security that this organization has and wants to maintain to help keep them safe and to keep our ideas safe, our information safe? And that's harder than ever because now people can get hired all around the world and they're working remote. They never go into the office. So how do you influence them in a positive way about what's important with your program, your security program? And so I think it all starts there. It starts with culture and how do you influence them to be part of the culture, which hopefully is safe, secure, production, and we're all kind of in this together because we are. I don't know that we have that opportunity as much anymore. The big, I think, challenge for security leaders in big organizations is you've got maybe 2, 3, 4 different types of folks that you're trying to keep safe in a work environment. Some are remote, some are hybrid, some are business offices, some are manufacturers, some are vendors, some are consultants and clients and customers. And so the standard model is very diverse now. And as working with security leaders, you've got to really be what we call semper gumby and build that ability to pivot into your program. And so if you're very heavy on the physical security side and you have a lot of physical security stuff, cameras, badge readers, gates, those kinds of things, security technology or physical security assets, you've got to build in the ability to pivot. Because tomorrow may not be guaranteed with that site. And you really got to put yourself in a position to be aligned with the leadership of the company, which wasn't always something. It's like, well, we've invested in this warehouse, so we're going to have this warehouse for the next 30 years, so put security in it. That was the kind of the standard approach. Now, we've had a surge of warehouses in, let's say, the Port of Los Angeles because we can't move our products because we don't have the truckers. So what are we going to do? Well, we're not going to stop our production supply chain coming from East Asia. We're going to put it in a warehouse. Okay, well, are we securing that warehouse? How are we doing this? And so
you got to be much more on your toes.
You do, and you can't allow yourself to be removed from those decision points and put yourself in a position to be part of that business, part of the business development, manufacturing, supply chain, and all business operations as well as human resources, because people will be the biggest expense in a business and are our biggest challenge right now.
All right. No, really, really good advice, Scott. All right. Let's bring this one home. What's the main takeaway that you want listeners to remember from our conversation?
The biggest thing that I think we get stuck in, that I always used to do it this way. Grace Hopper said the most dangerous phrase is, It's always been done this way. And so when we are approaching these pretty significant life events, COVID, war, famine, climate change, political upheaval, those are all opportunities to look at how did we do it in the past? If it worked and it will work for the future, I'm not saying you have to change it, but I think we all need to go and look at those things, spend time understanding why was it done this way and do we need to change something? Because if it can be changed and make things better for people, that's how you retain them. That's how you'll make your organization more sustainable, is being open to that change. I think historically, security has really shot itself in the foot with focusing on gates, guards, and guns, or gates, cards, and guards. We are evolving. You go to any of these major trade shows, you see the evolution of technology and the adoption of technology. And sure, it's expensive, but we need to be open to how are we going to work in a global society or with a global economy. And that's what our focus should be on.
Really appreciate that. And how can listeners get in touch?
Connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm Scot Walker, Scott with one T. In my LinkedIn profile, it has every way else that you can follow me. I put my podcast on YouTube and on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with people there and looking forward to hopefully our next conversation, Robert.
All right. Sure thing. Or for season 3 for sure.
Yeah.
Got you booked in. Scott, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, buddy.
Again, that was Scot Walker, principal of Walker and Associates and host of the Protective Future podcast. I'll include a link in the show notes for this episode. Thanks for listening to Talking Threat Intelligence. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you listen to episodes. And if you would like more insights on building a successful threat intelligence program, be sure to check out our website at liferafinc.com/blog. That's liferafinc.com/blog. And I hope you tune in next time.